What if, in a single night, a courageous decision could change not only your life, but transform an entire system of power and privilege? Find out how Maya, a simple waitress, confronts a powerful tycoon and sets off a chain of events that no one expected. What happens next will surprise you. Hello, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. The Starlight, one of Manhattan's most elegant restaurants, sparkled like a jewel in the New York night. Its large glass windows reflected the lights of the city that never sleeps, inviting passers-by to glimpse the world of luxury and sophistication that existed within its walls. That Friday evening, the restaurant was particularly busy. The buzz of conversation and the clink of cutlery created a familiar symphony for Maya Rodriguez, a 25-year-old waitress who'd been working at Starlight for almost 3 years. She moved gracefully between the tables, her impeccable uniform contrasting with her dark skin and black hair tied up in an elegant bun. Maya watched the front door open, announcing the arrival of more customers. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the imposing figure of Richard Harrington, the infamous New York real estate tycoon. He entered the restaurant as if he owned the place, followed by a retinue of equally well-dressed friends. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington," the maitre d' greeted with an exaggerated bow. "Your usual table is ready?" Richard nodded, barely glancing at the man. "Bring the usual champagne. Dom Perignon, vintage 2008. And don't keep me waiting." Maya felt a tightening in her stomach. She had served Richard before and knew he was a difficult customer, known for his generous tips, but also for his volatile temper and disparaging remarks. As she headed to the kitchen to get the champagne, Maya noticed a new family entering the restaurant. It was the Johnson family. She recognized them from a previous visit. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, accompanied by their 2 teenage children, were ushered to a table at the back of the room. "Welcome to Starlight," Maya greeted them with a genuine smile. "It's a pleasure to see you again." Mrs. Johnson smiled back. "Thank you, dear. We're celebrating our youngest's birthday today." Maya watched the youngest boy, who couldn't have been more than 14, shrink shyly into his seat. "Happy birthday," she exclaimed. "It'll make sure your night is special." Returning to Richard's table with the champagne, Maya couldn't help but notice the look of contempt he cast in the Johnson family's direction. She poured the glasses, trying to ignore the whispered comments between Richard and his friends. "Look at that," Richard muttered, loud enough for Maya to hear. "Looks like they've let anyone in here today. This place is losing its standards." Maya felt her blood boil, but kept her professional composure. She finished serving and walked away, casting a worried glance at the Johnson family, who seemed to be trying to ignore the stares and whispers coming from Richard's table. Starlight's executive chef, Antonio Rossi, emerged from the kitchen at that moment, his experienced eyes scanning the room. He noticed the tension in the air and frowned, approaching Maya. "Is everything all right, Maya?" he asked softly. Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, chef, everything is under control." But as the words left her mouth, she knew it wasn't true. The evening had barely begun, and Maya had a feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The aroma of exquisite dishes filled the air of the Starlight, but for Maya, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension. She continued her work, serving dishes and drinks efficiently, but her eyes were constantly on the 2 tables that now dominated her attention: Richard Harrington's and the Johnson family's. Richard, at his table in the center of the restaurant, was laughing loudly with his friends, the sound of his laughter echoing through the room. Maya noticed that, with each laugh, the looks of contempt towards the Johnson family intensified. "Hey, waitress!" Richard called out, snapping his fingers. Maya approached, maintaining a neutral expression. "Bring another bottle. And tell those people at the back to keep their children under control. This isn't a playground." Maya looked at the Johnson family. The 2 teenagers were sitting quietly, talking in low voices. There was nothing disturbing about their behavior. "Sir," Maya began, choosing her words carefully, "all our customers are behaving appropriately. I'll bring your bottle immediately." As she walked away, Maya heard Richard mutter something about the place going to shit. She clenched her fists, feeling anger rising in her chest. In the kitchen, Chef Antonio noticed Maya's tense expression. "What's going on out there, Maya?" Maya hesitated before answering. "Chef, Mr. Harrington is... well, he's being disrespectful to the Johnson family." Antonio frowned. "The family that's celebrating a birthday?" Maya nodded. "Yes, Chef. They're not doing anything wrong, but Mr. Harrington keeps making racist comments." The chef was silent for a moment, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and determination. "I see. I'll prepare something special for the Johnson family. In the meantime, Maya, keep an eye on the situation. If things get worse, let me know immediately." Maya returned to the lounge, carrying the bottle for Richard. As she passed the Johnsons' table, she couldn't help noticing the discomfort on their faces. Mrs. Johnson was trying to keep a smile, but her eyes betrayed her anguish. "Are you all right?" Maya asked softly. Mr. Johnson forced a smile. "Yes, thank you. We're fine." Maya knew it wasn't true, but she admired the dignity with which the family faced the situation. She poured the bottle at Richard's table, avoiding eye contact. "Finally," Richard grumbled. "You know, for such an expensive place, the service leaves a lot to be desired." Maya felt her blood boil again, but kept her composure. It was at that moment that Chef Antonio emerged from the kitchen, carrying a beautifully decorated plate. "Compliments of the house," the chef announced, placing the plate on the Johnsons' table. It was an elaborate dessert, decorated with "Happy Birthday" written in chocolate. The birthday boy's eyes lit up, and for a moment the tension seemed to dissipate. But then Richard's voice cut through the air again. "Well, well," he said, loud enough to be heard. "It seems that some get special treatment here." Maya watched the scene, feeling a mixture of emotions. The joy on the Johnson family's faces contrasted sharply with Richard's disdain. It was at that moment that Maya made a decision. She could no longer remain silent. Picking up a napkin and a pen, Maya began to write. Her hands trembled slightly, but her words were firm. She knew that what she was about to do could cost her her job, but the injustice before her was greater than her fear. Sometimes, Maya thought, it takes courage to do the right thing. With the note in hand, she took a deep breath and prepared herself for the confrontation that would change the course of the evening, and possibly much more. The starlight pulsed with the energy of a Friday night in New York, but for Maya, the world had been reduced to two focal points: the note in her hand and Richard Harrington's desk. She squeezed the paper between her fingers, feeling the weight of her words and the responsibility of her actions. Maya looked at the Johnson family once more. The young birthday boy smiled shyly at the special dessert, while his parents exchanged worried glances, clearly aware of the disparaging comments coming from Richard's table. With renewed determination, Maya straightened her shoulders and walked towards Richard's table. Every step echoed in her ears, amplified by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Mr. Harrington," Maya said, her voice surprisingly firm, "I have something for you." Richard raised an eyebrow, looking at Maya with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "What's that? I didn't ask for anything." Maya held out the folded note. "Please read this. It's important." Intrigued and slightly irritated, Richard took the paper. His friends watched curiously as he unfolded the note and began to read. "Mr. Harrington, my name is Maya Rodriguez. I'm your waitress tonight, but I'm much more than that. I'm the daughter of immigrants who came to this country in search of a better life. My parents worked 3 jobs each to give me the opportunity to study and be where I am today. I grew up hearing stories about people like you, people who judge others based on the color of their skin or their last name. But I also grew up learning about people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, who had the courage to stand up against injustice. You may not know it, but there is a story behind your own fortune. Your father, William Harrington, took on a significant debt with my grandfather in the 70s, a debt that has never been repaid and which helped build the empire you run today. The family you are belittling tonight could well be mine, or it could be yours, in other circumstances. I ask you to reflect on your actions and words. True greatness does not lie in the size of our bank account, but in our ability to treat everyone with dignity and respect. Respectfully. Maya Rodriguez Richard's face went through a series of emotions as he read. Surprise, anger, confusion, and finally, a shadow of shame. He looked at Maya, who was standing firm in her position. How do you know about my father? Richard stammered, his arrogance momentarily shaken. My grandfather kept all the documents, Maya replied calmly. He always believed that one day justice would be done. Richard's friends began to murmur amongst themselves, casting curious glances at Maya and the Johnson family. The tension in the air was palpable. At that moment, Chef Antonio, who had been observing the scene from afar, decided to intervene. He approached the table, his imposing presence attracting everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, the chef began, his voice calm but firm. Starlight has always prided itself on being a place where everyone is welcome and treated with respect. Tonight, we seem to have deviated from that principle. Richard seemed about to protest, but the look in the chef's eyes silenced him. In this restaurant, Antonio continued, we value not only the quality of our food, but also the quality of our character. I ask you all to reflect on this as you enjoy your meal. With those words, the chef walked away, leaving a heavy silence at Richard's table. Maya, sensing that her message had been delivered, began to walk away. Wait, Richard called out, his voice now devoid of its previous arrogance. I'd like to talk to you later if possible. Maya nodded silently and returned to her work, feeling the gazes of everyone in the restaurant on her. She knew she had started something that couldn't easily be reversed. The rest of the evening would be tense, but Maya felt a surge of pride at having found the courage to speak out. As she moved between the tables, she caught Mrs. Johnson's grateful gaze. At that moment, Maya knew that, regardless of the consequences, she had done the right thing. The buzz in the starlight had died down considerably after Maya and Chef Antonio's intervention. A tense silence hung over the restaurant, punctuated only by the occasional clink of cutlery and the muffled murmur of conversation. Richard Harrington remained seated at his table, Maya's note crumpled in his hand, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. His friends, once so animated, now looked uncomfortable, casting furtive glances at each other and at the Johnson family. Maya continued her work, moving between the tables with an outward calm that masked her inner turmoil. Every time she passed Richard's desk, she could feel his eyes on her, but he didn't call out to her. It was when Maya approached the Johnson family table again that the situation began to change. Mr. Johnson discreetly called out to her. "Miss," he said quietly, "we wanted to thank you for what you did. You didn't have to risk yourself for us." Maya smiled gently. "It was the right thing to do, sir. No one deserves to be treated like that." Mrs. Johnson took Maya's hand. "You're very brave, dear, but we're worried about you. We don't want you to lose your job because of us." Before Maya could reply, Richard's voice rang out across the restaurant. "Waitress, come here." Maya took a deep breath, exchanged a quick glance with the Johnson family, and headed for Richard's table. As she approached, she noticed that his face was red, a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard hissed, keeping his voice low but full of anger. "You have no idea who I am or what I'm capable of." Maya kept her composure. "Mr. Harrington, I know exactly who you are, and that's why I did what I did." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. The movement attracted the attention of everyone in the restaurant. "You have no right to judge me or to expose my family's private affairs." At that moment, Chef Antonio quickly emerged from the kitchen, alerted by the commotion. He positioned himself next to Maya, a protective and imposing presence. "Is there a problem here?" Antonio asked, his voice calm but firm. Richard looked at the chef, then at Maya, then back at the chef. He seemed to be struggling internally, torn between his anger and the awareness that he was in a public place. It was at this point that one of Richard's friends, a middle-aged man with grey hair, decided to intervene. "Richard, maybe we should calm down and think about this. The girl might have a point." Richard turned sharply to his friend. "What? Are you on her side now, Charles?" Charles held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not on anyone's side. I just think we should consider what she said. After all, a person's true worth isn't just in their wealth, is it?" The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Richard, waiting for his reaction. Maya could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she stood her ground. Slowly, the other customers began to speak up. Murmurs of support for the Johnson family, and Maya could be heard. Some even began to applaud softly. Richard, finding himself increasingly isolated, made a sudden movement as if to leave, but then stopped. His gaze met that of the Johnson family, who were watching the scene with a mixture of apprehension and dignity. It was at that moment that Maya decided to step forward. With a courage that even she didn't know she possessed, she addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice clear and firm, "no one here is trying to humiliate you or judge you. We're just asking you to reflect on your actions and words. We all have the capacity to change and grow." The restaurant fell completely silent, everyone waiting for Richard's response. The tycoon looked around, seeing the expectant faces, some defiant, others hopeful. For the first time that evening, Richard Harrington seemed truly speechless. Chef Antonio, feeling the need to ease the tension, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we take this moment to reflect on what unites us, rather than what divides us? In my kitchen, ingredients from all over the world come together to create something beautiful. Maybe we can learn from that." As the chef's words hung in the air, Maya realized that this was only the beginning. The evening still held more surprises and perhaps the possibility of a real transformation. The silence that followed Chef Antonio's words was almost palpable. The starlight, normally a place of lively conversation and laughter, now seemed suspended in time, with all eyes alternating between Richard Harrington and Maya Rodriguez. Richard, still standing, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. His face, once red with anger, now displayed a mixture of emotions: shame, confusion, and surprisingly, a hint of curiosity. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. It was at that moment that Mrs. Johnson, with a courage born of years of facing prejudice, got up from her table and walked towards Richard. The whole restaurant held its breath. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I'd like to share something with you, if I may." Richard, taken aback, just nodded silently. "My husband and I," she continued, "are doctors. We've spent our lives caring for people of all colors, creeds, and social classes. Do you know what we've learned? That under the skin, we're all the same. We all bleed the same color. We all feel pain. We all love our children." Mr. Johnson joined his wife, placing a hand on her shoulder in support. "We're here today, celebrating our youngest son's birthday. He dreams of being a successful businessman one day, maybe even like you." The Johnson couple's words seemed to touch something deep within Richard. For the first time that evening, he really looked at them, not through them, but at them. Maya watched the scene, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. She noticed that many of the other customers were visibly moved, some even wiping away discreet tears. Richard finally found his voice. I don't know what to say," he mumbled, his previous arrogance completely dissipated. I never considered." Chef Antonio, sensing that the time was right, approached again. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. and Mr. Johnson, why don't you sit down together? Perhaps a conversation could be the start of a greater understanding." To everyone's surprise, Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, I'd like that." As the Johnsons joined Richard at the table, Maya stepped aside to give them some privacy. She made her way to the kitchen, feeling emotionally exhausted but strangely light-hearted. In the kitchen, Chef Antonio found her. Maya, what you did tonight was extraordinary. Few would have the courage to stand up to injustice like that. Maya smiled shyly. Thank you, Chef. I just hope it makes a difference. Sometimes, Antonio replied, all we need is one brave person to initiate change. You may have done more than you realize. Back in the restaurant lounge, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The previous tension had given way to a climate of reflection and, surprisingly, dialogue. At the table where Richard and the Johnsons were sitting, conversation flowed, punctuated by moments of hesitant laughter and thoughtful expressions. Other customers, inspired by the scene, began their own discussions about prejudice, privilege, and the importance of mutual respect. The Starlight that night had become an impromptu forum for important and long-overdue conversations. Maya, returning to the lounge, caught fragments of the conversation between Richard and the Johnsons. I never really stopped to think, she heard Richard say. My father always said, but now I see how wrong that was. Mrs. Johnson replied gently, the important thing is that we're having this conversation now. It's a start. As the evening progressed, Maya continued her work, but with a new sense of purpose. She had risked everything for what she believed in, and somehow it seemed that her actions were causing ripples that went far beyond that night at the Starlight. When the restaurant finally began to empty, Maya noticed that Richard and the Johnsons were still talking, their expressions more relaxed and open than at the beginning of the evening. She smiled to herself, thinking that maybe, just maybe, something truly transformative had begun there. Chef Antonio approached her one last time that evening. Maya, he said with a warm smile, you reminded us tonight that true hospitality goes beyond serving good food. It's about treating each person with dignity and respect. I'm proud to have you on our team. Maya felt a wave of emotion run through her. Thank you, Chef, she replied, her voice breaking. That means a lot to me. As Starlight prepared to close, Maya knew that the events of that night would stay with her forever. And looking over at the table where Richard and the Johnsons were still talking, she had the feeling that the impact of her actions would extend far beyond those walls. The weeks that followed the fateful night at the Starlight were a whirlwind of emotions and changes for everyone involved. Maya, still processing the events of that night, continued her work at the restaurant with a new perspective and a renewed sense of purpose. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The restaurant was quiet, and Maya was helping to prepare the tables for dinner when the doorbell rang. She looked up and was surprised to see Richard Harrington entering, alone and with a serious expression on his face. Good afternoon, Richard said, his voice softer than Maya remembered. Can I talk to you for a moment? Maya nodded, feeling a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Of course, Mr. Harrington. They sat down at a discreet table in the corner of the restaurant. Richard seemed nervous, something Maya had never imagined seeing in him. First, he began, I want to apologize. My behavior that night was unacceptable. You had the courage to confront me, and I didn't react well at first. Maya listened attentively, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Richard continued, After that conversation with the Johnson family, I did a lot of thinking. I realized how much damage my attitudes and words can do. And also, I looked into the debt you mentioned. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. You were right. My father did owe your grandfather money. I'd like to settle that debt, with interest. Maya was speechless for a moment. Mr. Harrington, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Richard replied. There's more. After that night, I started to rethink a lot of things in my life and in my business. I realized that I can use my position and resources to do more good. Just then, Chef Antonio, who had noticed Richard's arrival, approached the table. Is everything all right here? He asked, his protective tone towards Maya evident. Richard turned to the chef. Yes, actually, I'd like to talk to you too, if possible. Antonio nodded and joined them at the table. Chef, Richard began, I'd like to make a proposal. I'm starting a scholarship and training program for young people from underprivileged communities interested in gastronomy and hospitality. I was wondering if Starlight would be interested in being a partner in this initiative. Antonia was visibly surprised. "That's unexpected, Mr. Harrington, but certainly something we'd like to consider." Maya, still processing everything, finally found her voice. "Mr. Harrington, that's incredible. But what's changed?" Richard smiled slightly. "You've changed, Maya. Your courage, the Johnson family's words, the atmosphere of this place, all made me realize that I had the opportunity and the responsibility to do better." Chef Antonio, with a twinkle in his eye, proposed, "Why don't we continue this conversation with dinner? I think we have a lot to discuss and plan." Richard agreed enthusiastically. "That would be great. In fact, I've taken the liberty of inviting some special guests, if you don't mind." Just then, the door to the restaurant opened again, and the Johnson family entered, cautious smiles on their faces. Maya felt a wave of emotion run through her. Seeing Richard, the Johnsons and Chef Antonio together, ready for a constructive conversation, was more than she could have hoped for. As the chef went into the kitchen to prepare a special menu for the evening, and Richard stood up to greet the Johnsons, Maya stood alone for a moment, reflecting. Her small act of courage had triggered something much bigger than she could have imagined. The rest of the evening was filled with lively conversation, plans for the future, and, most importantly, a genuine sense of connection and mutual understanding. Maya watched with joy as Richard interacted with the Johnsons, his demeanor completely transformed from that first night. As dinner drew to a close, Richard turned to Maya one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for having the courage to show me a better way." Maya smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "Sometimes, all we need is someone to remind us of our shared humanity," she replied. As the guests left, Maya and Chef Antonio exchanged a look of satisfaction. Starlight had always been more than just a restaurant. It was a place where people connected. And that night, it had become the setting for the start of a truly significant change. The months that followed that transformative night at the Starlight brought significant changes not only for Richard Harrington, but for everyone involved. The restaurant, once just a place for fine dining, had become the epicenter of a quiet revolution in the community. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the Starlight was closed to the regular public. Instead, it was full of eager young faces, the first beneficiaries of Richard's scholarship program. Maya, now promoted to assistant manager, watched with pride as Chef Antonio conducted a practical class for the students. Richard entered the restaurant, his bearing still imposing, but his expression much softer than before. He smiled as he saw the scene before him. "Maya," he called, approaching, "how are things going?" Maya returned his smile. "Better than we could have imagined, Mr. Harrington. These young people are incredible, so talented and eager to learn." Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "You know, Maya, I spent most of my life believing that success meant only accumulating wealth and power. But now," he paused, watching a young student perfectly execute a julienne cut. "Now I understand that true success lies in making a difference in people's lives." Maya felt a surge of emotion. "You certainly are making a difference, Mr. Harrington." Richard turned to her, his gaze serious. "It wouldn't have happened without you, Maya. Your courage that night, well, it changed everything." Just then, Chef Antonio approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "Richard, Maya, come and see this. We've got something special going on in the kitchen." The three of them headed for the kitchen, where they found one of the students, a young man called Darius, hard at work on a dish. "Darius has come up with an incredible idea," Antonio explained. "He's combining French cooking techniques with flavors from his African-American heritage. It's absolutely brilliant." Richard watched the young man work, clearly impressed. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we were hoping to see. Darius, you're doing an incredible job." Darius' face lit up at the compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I never imagined I'd have an opportunity like this." Maya felt her heart fill with pride and gratitude. It was incredible to see how a simple act of courage had triggered so many positive changes. Later that day, after the class had finished and the students had left, Richard, Maya, and Antonio sat down to discuss the progress of the program. "I've been thinking," Richard began, "about expanding this beyond cooking. Maybe we can create similar programs in other areas: business, technology, the arts." Maya and Antonio exchanged looks of surprise and enthusiasm. "That would be amazing, Richard," Antonio replied. "But it's a huge project. Are you sure you're ready for it?" Richard smiled, a determined glint in his eyes. "More than ready. In fact, I've already started making some contacts. And guess who's agreed to be our partner in the medical field?" Maya's eyes widened. "Don't tell me that—" "Exactly," Richard confirmed. "Dr. Johnson and her husband. They're enthusiastic about the idea of mentoring young potential doctors from underprivileged communities." Chef Antonio laughed, shaking his head in admiration. "What do you know? From a restaurant confrontation to a life-changing partnership." Maya felt tears forming in her eyes. "That's incredible. Really incredible." Richard put a hand on Maya's shoulder. "And it all started with you, Maya. Your courage opened my eyes to a world I had chosen to ignore for too long. You showed me that it's possible to change, no matter what age or circumstances." Maya wiped away a tear. "I only did what I thought was right. I never imagined it would lead to all this." "That's how change happens," Antonio reflected. "One small act of courage can set off a chain reaction of kindness and transformation." As the three continued to discuss their plans for the future, Maya couldn't help but marvel at how much their lives had changed. The Starlight, once just a restaurant, had become a symbol of hope and opportunity. And Richard Harrington, the man who once represented everything Maya despised, was now using his power and influence to make a real difference in the world. He was living proof that change was possible, that the heart could be transformed. As the sun set over New York, casting a golden glow through the Starlight's windows, Maya felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. The future, once uncertain, now seemed bright and full of possibilities. Autumn arrived in New York, painting the city in shades of red and gold. The Starlight, now a symbol of transformation and hope, was preparing for a special event. It was the official launch of the Harrington Foundation for Education and Opportunity, and the restaurant had been chosen as the perfect venue for the occasion. Maya, dressed in an elegant black suit, was overseeing the final preparations. The nervousness and excitement were palpable in the air. She could hardly believe how much her life had changed in the last few months. Chef Antonio emerged from the kitchen, his face glowing with pride. "Everything is ready, Maya. Tonight will be unforgettable." Maya smiled, adjusting a floral arrangement. "I hope so, Chef. There's so much at stake." The door to the restaurant opened, and Richard Harrington walked in, accompanied by a diverse group of people: business people, educators, community leaders, and to Maya's surprise, her own parents. "Maya!" her mother exclaimed, rushing to hug her. "We're so proud of you, mija." Maya returned the hug, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mommy, Daddy, what are you doing here?" Richard approached, smiling. "I invited them. After all, they're a crucial part of this story." Maya's father held out his hand to Richard. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for honoring my father's memory in this way." Richard shook his hand firmly. "It's the least I can do. Your family deserves this recognition." As more guests arrived, the Starlight came alive. The Johnson family entered, followed by a group of young students from the scholarship program. Maya watched with delight as Richard greeted each one by name, showing a genuine interest in their lives and aspirations. When everyone had gathered, Richard took to the small makeshift stage. Silence fell over the room. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice firm but warm. "We are here tonight to celebrate not just the launch of a foundation, but the birth of a new vision for our community." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "A few months ago, I was a different man, blinded by privilege and prejudice. It took the courage of a young waitress to open my eyes." Maya felt all eyes on her and blushed. Richard continued, "Maya Rodriguez showed me that true greatness does not lie in the size of our bank account, but in the ability to treat everyone with dignity and respect. and it is in this spirit that we have launched the Harrington Foundation." He then detailed the foundation's objectives: scholarships, mentoring programs, investments in underprivileged communities. With each announcement, the room erupted in applause. "But we don't stop there," Richard said, a twinkle in his eye. "I'm delighted to announce that Starlight will be transformed. Half of its operations will be dedicated to training and employing young people from disadvantaged communities, giving them a real chance in the world of gastronomy and hospitality." Chef Antonio, standing next to Maya, let out a sigh of surprise and joy. "And to lead this new chapter of Starlight," Richard continued, "I can't think of anyone better than the person who started this whole journey. Maya Rodriguez, would you agree to become Starlight's new general manager?" Maya was stunned, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her parents hugged her, tears of pride in their eyes. On shaky legs, Maya took to the stage. I'm honored," she managed to say, "and I promise to do my best to continue this mission of change and inclusion." The room erupted in deafening applause. Maya saw smiling faces everywhere: her parents, the Johnson family, the young students, all celebrating not just their personal achievement, but the promise of a better future for the whole community. As the celebration continued into the night, Maya had a moment of reflection. Looking around Starlight, she saw more than just a restaurant. She saw a symbol of transformation, a beacon of hope. Chef Antonio approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Maya. Your act of courage triggered all of this?" Maya smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "No, Chef, we did it, all of us." And as the evening progressed, filled with laughter, music, and the promise of a new beginning, Maya knew that this was just the first page of a new chapter, not just for her, but for all those whose lives would be touched by the wave of change that began on an ordinary night at Starlight. Winter had arrived in New York, covering the city in a white blanket of snow. 6 months had passed since the launch of the Harrington Foundation, and Starlight, under Maya's leadership, had become a beacon of hope and opportunity for the community. It was a cold Saturday morning, but the inside of the Starlight was warm and welcoming. Maya was walking around the restaurant, checking on the preparations for a special event. Today, they would be celebrating the graduation of the first class of the Gastronomy and Hospitality Training Program. "Maya," an excited voice called out. It was Darius, the young chef whose talent had impressed everyone months ago. "Everything's ready in the kitchen. I can't wait to show everyone what we've learned." Maya smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I'm sure everyone will be impressed, Darius. You and your colleagues have worked hard to get this far." As the guests began to arrive, Maya felt a little chill in her stomach. This was not only an important day for the graduates, but also proof of the success of the program she had helped to create. Richard Harrington walked in, accompanied by the Johnson family. In recent months, they had become close partners in the foundation, working tirelessly to expand opportunities for young people from underprivileged communities. "Maya," Richard greeted her warmly. "This place looks amazing. You've really exceeded all expectations." Dr. Johnson added, "And the reports we've been getting about the medical mentoring program are extraordinary. You've inspired change that goes far beyond these walls." Maya blushed at the praise. "Thank you, but the credit goes to all of us. This is a collective victory." Chef Antonio emerged from the kitchen, his face glowing with pride. "It's time," he announced. "Our graduates are ready." The guests settled in, and one by one, the young chefs in training presented their dishes. Each creation was a unique fusion of classic techniques and diverse cultural influences, reflecting each student's background and life experiences. Darius was the last to present. His dish, a modern reinterpretation of a soul food classic, drew enthusiastic applause from the judges and guests. After the presentations, Richard took to the small makeshift stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we've seen today is nothing short of extraordinary. These talented young people are living proof that, when given equal opportunities, human potential knows no bounds." He paused, his gaze meeting Maya's. But none of this would have been possible without the vision and dedication of one person in particular, Maya Rodriguez not only inspired me to be a better person, she showed us all the transformative power of courage and compassion. Maya felt tears forming in her eyes as the room erupted in applause. Richard continued, "That's why I'm pleased to announce that, as of today, our gastronomy scholarship program will officially be called the Maya Rodriguez Program for Culinary Excellence." Maya was stunned, unable to hold back the tears that were now running freely down her face. Her parents, sitting in the front row, stood up, applauding with pride. Chef Antonio gently guided her to the stage. "A few words, Maya?" he whispered encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Maya addressed the crowd. I am deeply honored and moved," she began, her voice trembling. "When I confronted injustice that night so many months ago, I never imagined it would come to this. But I've learned that a small act of courage can unleash a wave of positive change." She looked at the smiling faces of the graduates. "To all of you graduating today, remember this. You have the power to make a difference. Use your talents not only to create delicious dishes, but to nourish communities and inspire change." When Maya finished her speech, the room erupted in applause and cheers. Darius and the other graduates rushed to hug her, their faces beaming with gratitude and hope. As the celebration continued, Maya found herself reflecting on the incredible journey she had experienced. From a simple waitress to a respected community leader, she had not only transformed her own life, but touched countless others. Chef Antonio approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You know, Maya," he said softly, "in all my years of cooking, I've never seen an ingredient as powerful as courage. And you, my dear, have that to spare." Maya smiled through her tears, feeling a mixture of gratitude and determination. She knew that this was only the beginning. With every life touched, with every dream realized, the wave of change she had started would continue to spread, transforming not just individuals, but entire communities. And as the starlight glowed, filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of delicious food, Maya knew she had found her true calling, not just as a chef or manager, but as a catalyst for change, inspiring others to find their own courage and make a difference in the world. A year has passed since the graduation of the first class of the Maya Rodriguez Program for Culinary Excellence. Starlight, now a symbol of transformation and inclusion, was preparing to celebrate its anniversary with a grand charity event. Maya, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress, was overseeing the final preparations with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The restaurant looked stunning, decorated with flowers and soft lights, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and welcome. "Everything is perfect, Maya," said Chef Antonio, appearing at her side. "Tonight will be unforgettable." Maya smiled, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. "I hope so, Chef. There's so much at stake." What Maya hadn't shared with anyone was the news she had received the week before. A financial scandal involving Richard Harrington was about to come to light, threatening not only his reputation, but the entire work of the foundation. As the guests began to arrive, celebrities, politicians, community leaders, Maya felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She knew that tonight could be crucial for the future of everything they had built. Richard arrived, his face tense despite his forced smile. Maya discreetly pulled him to one side. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, "we need to talk about—" "I know, Maya," he interrupted, his voice tired. "The news is going to break tomorrow. I'm sorry. I'm afraid I've put everything at risk." Maya felt her heart squeeze. Everything they had worked for, all the lives they had changed, were under threat. Just then, Darius approached, now an assistant chef at Starlight. "Maya, Mr. Harrington, is everything all right?" Maya exchanged a glance with Richard before answering. "Darius, we need your help. Gather the other graduates of the program. We have a situation." As Darius left to fulfill the request, Maya turned to Richard. "We're not going to give up without a fight. You taught us that, remember?" Richard nodded slowly, a glint of determination returning to his eyes. Within minutes, Maya found herself in an impromptu meeting in the kitchen with Richard, Darius, and a group of graduates from the program. She quickly explained the situation. "What can we do?" asked one of the young chefs, her voice full of concern. Maya took a deep breath. "Let's tell our story, the real story. Not just Mr. Harrington's, but all of ours. How our lives have changed, how this community has been transformed." "But what about the scandal?" Darius questioned. "Let's face it head on," Maya replied, "with honesty and transparency. We'll show that the mistakes of the past don't define who we are today or the good we've done." The group agreed and quickly drew up a plan. While the guests enjoyed their cocktails, Maya and her team worked behind the scenes, preparing for the crucial moment. When it came time for the speeches, Maya took to the stage, her heart pounding. She looked out at the audience, seeing both familiar and strange faces, all waiting to hear about the successes of the past year. "Good evening, everyone," Maya began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "We're here to celebrate a year of transformations and achievements, but we're also here to talk about something else, redemption and second chances." A murmur ran through the audience as Maya continued, telling the full story of Starlight and the Harrington Foundation. She held nothing back, not Richard's mistakes, nor the challenges they faced. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will read in the newspapers about mistakes made in the past, but I ask you to look around you. See the lives that have been transformed, the opportunities created, the hope restored." One by one, the program's graduates took to the stage, sharing their stories of overcoming and growth. Darius spoke about how the program saved him from the streets. Others told how their families had been positively impacted. Finally, Richard Harrington took to the stage. His voice shook with emotion as he admitted his past mistakes and committed to doing the right things, no matter the personal cost. "I'm not asking you to ignore my mistakes," he said. "I'm asking you to see beyond them to the good we can continue to do together." The silence that followed was deafening. Maya held her breath, fearing the worst. Then, slowly, one person began to applaud, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding. Dr. Johnson, with tears in her eyes, approached Maya. "That," she said, "is true leadership. You have transformed a crisis into a moment of unity and renewal." In the days that followed, the story of Starlight and the Harrington Foundation dominated the headlines, but not as Maya had feared. Instead of a devastating scandal, it became a story of redemption, transparency, and the transformative power of community. Donations to the foundation increased. More companies offered to partner with us. The scholarship program expanded to other cities. Weeks later, Maya was back at Starlight, watching a new class of students begin their training. Darius, now an instructor, was guiding a young chef through the preparation of a sauce. Chef Antonio approached, a proud smile on his face. "You know, Maya," he said, "when you confronted Richard that first night, you didn't just change his life. You created ripples that continue to spread, touching lives we can't even imagine." Maya smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. "It's amazing how a small act of courage can lead to something so big," she reflected. "Not so small," Antonio corrected gently. "It was a huge act of courage. And look what he built." As the sun set over New York, casting a golden glow through the Starlight's windows, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still have challenges, but she knew that together they could face anything. Starlight shone brighter than ever, not just as a restaurant, but as a beacon of hope, showing that with courage, compassion, and community, true transformation is possible. And Maya, the waitress who dared to speak out, was now leading that transformation, inspiring others to find their own courage and make a difference in the world, one plate, one story, one life at a time. If you were in Maya's shoes that fateful night at Starlight, would you have the courage to confront injustice, even if you knew it could cost you your job? What do you think would give you the strength to act or make you hesitate? How would you deal with the consequences of your decision, whether positive or negative? Leave your opinion in the comments. Thanks for watching. Comment below what you thought of this story and from which city you are watching us. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so that together we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories. Until next time.